We hope that everyone has a wonderful experience today. Dr. Goforth, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Goforth, and I am a recent graduate of the doctoral program at Sam Houston State University. My degree was in higher education with a concentration in academic support programs. I'm currently a football academic coordinator and tutor coordinator at Duke University, and today I'm going to be sharing my dissertation research with you guys on the major and course selection of Black male student athletes, specifically revolving around the phenomenon of academic clustering. So I'm going to start off today by introducing the study and giving you a little bit of background information, and then I'm going to discuss the theoretical frameworks I use, the research questions, followed by a discussion of the methods and the data collections used. I'll sort of glide over that stuff because I know that's sort of boring to a lot of people, and then I'll get into the bulk of the presentation, which will cover the main findings, the overarching themes, as well as recommendations for practice and future research. So academic clustering is defined as when 25% or more of a team majors in the same subject. A lot of the current literature on this topic examines the issue sort of from a program level and ignores the actual experience of the athletes who are in these clustered majors. And the clustering in of itself is not necessarily an issue, as many athletes may be interested in similar topics due to their similar interest and backgrounds, especially when you spend your whole life playing a sport for 30 to 40 hours a week in order to be a Division One athlete. However, where clustering can be an issue is if a student's academic freedom is being limited by their participation in intercollegiate athletics. There are also some ethical issues at play here because clustering very often undermines the educational value and reinforces negative stereotypes about athletes, particularly those who are minority students who play in revenue-producing sports, because a lot of times they get labeled as dumb jocks. And studies have also shown that students who graduate from clustered majors also face poor career outcomes. So my overall goal of the study was to address the issue of why clustering happens from an individual perspective instead of just looking at it from a numbers perspective at the group level. A lot of current studies use deficit-based approaches and deficit-based narratives to explain academic clustering instead of actually speaking to the people most directly affected by this issue, which are the student athletes themselves. So this study is grounded in two different theoretical frameworks. The first is andragogy, or the theory of adult learning, which states that self-directed learning is vital for adult students. Academic clustering, by forcing these students into predetermined paths, directly limits this autonomy and choice. And the second theoretical framework I used is called ecological systems theory, and it's developed by Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And my goal with using this theory was to highlight the various systems surrounding student athletes, such as coaches, administrators, families, peers, and anyone else that they come in contact with that can significantly influence their academic decision. This framework also recognizes a concept called bidirectional influence, which highlights how student athletes both shape their environment while their environment is also shaping them. So, in examining the previous literature on this topic, like I said before, a lot of these articles were people talking about athletes instead of actually talking to the athletes themselves. So previous studies found that academic clustering was widely prevalent, especially at the Division One level. Studies also found that clustering was more common in Black male athletes who participate in revenue sports versus other groups. And then studies also showed that there are a lot of different factors that contribute to academic clustering. This could include underpreparedness, the influence of coaches, teammates, parents, advisors, and then on a more macro scale, NCAA rules and regulations. Studies also showed that the transfer portal has had a significant impact on academic clustering, and there were several negative outcomes to academic clustering, included limited academic freedom, lower GPAs, and negative stereotypes. So I used three different research questions here. The first one was, how do Black male athletes experience major and course selection at the Division One level in revenue producing sports? The second question is, what contextual factors influence the experience? And my third question kind of has 2 points. The first is to discuss how external pressures, such as coaches, media, affect major and course selection. And then the second part of question three is more what internal pressures such as personal interests, career goals, how do they impact a student's major and course selection? So the methodology used was a transcendental phenomenological approach. The site was a Division One university on the East Coast, which I will refer to as Small State University, or SSU. All the participants were Black male athletes in a revenue-producing sport. Most of them, if not all of them, transferred at some point. Some transferred into SSU and some transferred out. Um, And then this just gives a little more detail. I did one-on-one interviews, part of the data analysis. Like I said, I'm not going to highlight that today. I can always answer more questions about that later. My study included 10 participants, all of whom were Black male student athletes in the sport of basketball. Um, of the 10 students, 4 of them ended up being forced into a clustered major, and 2 picked the clustered major that fit with their career choices. So it was technically above 25%, but it was something that they were interested in. Jim ended up graduating undergrad with a business degree, but was lied to when he transferred for his grad year. He was under the impression that he was pursuing a graduate certificate, but actually ended up in like a undergrad professional development program. Thomas, on the other hand, was business at Sam Houston State, and I think these two stories are significantly important. Um, he wanted to do business, but he was offered a massive NIL deal and transferred into a business program at a much bigger school. Unfortunately, the coach that recruited him was fired at the beginning of the season. He had to transfer again his second year. He is now at a much smaller school, and I think today actually committed to a fourth school in 4 years, because at the end of the year, as this year concluded, he was left with the option of turning down a major NIL deal, life-changing generational family money, or staying at the smaller school and getting the degree that he wants. So he's currently navigating, is it possible for him to even graduate with business at his fourth school in 4 years? So after doing the data analysis, there were 7 sub-themes that emerged. Here's a general overview of each of them, and we'll spend the next several slides going through them individually and discussing how the participant narratives fit within each theme. So I'm going to start off by discussing how students experienced a limited autonomy in their major and course selection. So the first student I'm going to talk about is Trey. Trey enrolled at SSU as a freshman and applied at a pre-business major. In spite of declaring his intent to do business on his application, when he was describing his process of enrolling for his first semester, he stated that he honestly didn't talk about it with his advisor, and his advisor just kind of put him in whatever it was, and that was the end of it. Jim, who I mentioned before, shared a similar experience with his initial registration by stating that he felt like he was being led down a path between choosing sports management or integrative studies because it was the path most of his teammates took. He was actively discouraged from pursuing business and was told that it was really hard and that other people had tried and failed out of the major. Despite communicating his interest the second he got to SSU, he did not take a single business class until the end of his sophomore year. Jacob, although he was a transfer, also had limited choice in his initial major selection at SSU and stated that he didn't really have a choice because most of his credits didn't transfer when he came in. So he was completely forced into a major that he wasn't interested in. Overall, each of these narratives show how the students had little to no autonomy during their initial and major course selection at SSU, regardless of whether or not they ended up in a clustered major, or if they started at SSU, or if they started at a previous institution or transferred in. The next sub-theme I'm going to discuss is transfer portal and eligibility. Given the fact that every participant transferred at least once, it was really important for me to highlight this, and this was brought up in every single interview. I'm only going to talk about two situations. So Isaac had a significant issue with his eligibility. He was under the impression that at his second institution, so SSU was his third school, that he was a strategic communications and media major or something related to communications. Unfortunately, when he arrived at SSU, when we were looking at his transcript, we realized that wasn't true. He had not taken a single communications course during his first 3 years and could not only not pursue communications at SSU, he was so far behind that he had to take 12 credits in the summer to be eligible in a major that he wasn't even interested in. Trey, after SSU, transferred after his sophomore year. He had the same struggles when he transferred to his second institution and stated that although they gave him options because he didn't have a lot of business credits because his advisor at SSU did not put him in the right classes, he couldn't take the classes that he wanted, and he would have, much like Isaac, had to take a ton of summer school and graduated even later than he already did. What's really interesting about both of these narratives is that decisions made early in their career, all the way to their very first semester, and even when like, they filled out their application, all those problems got exacerbated while they entered the transfer portal. So these are not decisions that are happening at the last minute. Things that happen first semester can trickle down and impact you 3.5 years later, even if you're not thinking about it. The next two themes discuss external factors that were influential in the decision of the major. Isaac stated that at his initial institution, he told advisors he wanted to study communications, but was talked out of it by his advisor, who told them that they were concerned about him taking a rigorous communication course during COVID and suggested pushing it off to another year. Unfortunately, he transferred from this institution after his freshman year and never got to take the course. Tim transferred into SSU after his junior year, and when discussing his major selection at his initial institution, he gave a lot of insight on how coaches can impact this decision. He told me that his coach emphasized that they didn't want him or any of his teammates doing poorly in their courses and discouraged him from doing something more challenging because a student from the previous year had recently been declared ineligible. Given the power coaches hold over students in terms of playing time, scholarship renewals, and NIL deals, coaches' suggestions carry a lot more weight than they probably think. Mike graduated, on the other hand, Mike graduated from SSU in 4 years. He was in a clustered major, but it was something that he chose to do, and he had 1 year of extra eligibility due to COVID. He had narrowed down his choices to two schools. One had a master's in sports psychology that he was interested in, as it would benefit him in his future career aspirations to be a basketball coach, and the other school only had a program in higher ed. After telling the coach at the second school that there was not a program he was interested in, the coach ignored him completely, held an impromptu meeting with him, his mom, and his cousin to say that the other school also didn't have a program either because he needed a doctor to be a sports psychologist. And at some point after that, he realized that the coach really hadn't listened to anything he said about school and ultimately picked the first institution. These narratives really highlight how students are impacted by their coaches and advisors, but sometimes even in an indirect way. Very rarely was someone told directly not to do something, but they were gently guided certain directions, whether that have been intentionally or not. Coaches and advisors were not the only individuals who had an impact on the major and course selection of the participants. Jordan, who graduated from SSU after 4 years, stated that he knew some of his teammates picked a major uh, just to pick a major, and he didn't want to do that, especially if he was going to graduate from SSU. He really, really emphasized that he did not want to do anything to just slip by or do the easiest major. So in his case, he was influenced positively by seeing teammates who ended up in majors that he didn't interest that they weren't interested in. Jaden, on the other hand, was positively influenced by a teammate. Jaden transferred from SSU after his sophomore year and was teammates with Mike. He stated that Mike influenced him because he also wanted to be a coach and saw that Mike was doing integrative studies and thought that it would be a great fit, so he wanted to follow in his footsteps. Jim, who graduated from SSU with a degree in business. He graduated in 4 years, and he really emphasized how his family impacted his decision by mentioning that his dad is from Ghana. Unless you're a doctor, lawyer, engineer, then you're wasting your degree. Although he didn't end up in any of those majors, it still impacted his decision from doing anything softer than business, which was one of the few degrees his dad approved of. Overall, these narratives show how family and friends may influence decisions both in a positive manner, such as Jaden and Jordan, but also in a stressful manner, such as Jim. Another theme that emerged from the data was deviation from best practices. The advising protocol at SSU was that every student athlete was required to meet with their major advisor, who would give them a list of courses to choose from. The student would then either work by themselves or with their athletic academic coordinator to pick classes that fit with their practice and game schedule. The registration needed to be approved by all parties in order for the hold to be removed so they could register. In spite of that requirement, 9 of the 10 participants stated that they were registered for courses at least one semester without meeting an advisor, and Isaac, who was at SSU for 3 years, only met with an advisor one time, yet somehow remained continuously registered. In fact, advisors on campus were so distrusting of the process that Jaden had issues even finding an advisor who would meet with him and got sent back and forth between integrative studies and the underclad office 4 times in the very same semester. So, in terms of internal influences on academic clustering, one theme found in the data was that students had a hard time balancing their academic and athletic responsibilities. Jacob transferred to SSU after his junior year, after attending 2 different institutions during his first 3 years of college. In those 3 years, in addition to transferring, he also changed majors from business to communications because of basketball and the time constraints, stating that it was too hard to manage both. Jim, whose father, like I mentioned before, was pushing him into more difficult majors, stated that if he had gone down those paths, he would have experienced a lot more time constraints and ultimately felt that he would not have been able to finish those degrees because of basketball. Time constraints even impacted extracurricular activities and career opportunities as well. Isaac mentioned that at his first institution, he was given the opportunity to be the play-by-play announcer for a women's basketball game and could not do it because of his own commitments with his team. So the last theme I'm going to discuss before we get into recommendations focuses on how personal interest and career aspirations in fact, do play a role in major and course selection of Black male student athletes. Given the fact that Mike wanted to be a coach, when deciding his major at SSU, even though his major was considered a clustered major, he believed that the major was a great fit for his career aspirations. He stated that the tools that he would learn through the actual courses in the major caught his interest and that they were things that he needed to know in order to be the coach that he wanted to be. Much like Mike, Jim was able to find a major that fit his interests. He stated that he really did enjoy business and is something that he is fascinated in. Although Jacob, on the other hand, did not get to pursue the major he initially wanted, he was able to find something that was sort of related to his career and something that he was somewhat interested in. And this is in direct contrast to the fact that previous literature very much puts the onus of academic clustering on the students by stating that they're not academically prepared or they don't care about school. And I thought it was really interesting that these narratives directly challenge that belief. So now that I've gone through the themes, I'm going to discuss three recommendations. The first is to reframe the definition of academic clustering. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the 25% measure used to define clustering often ignores the individual experience of the student and include narratives that are not actually academic clustering, while excluding narratives where a student's academic freedom was limited by their participation in college athletics. So, for example, Mike and Jaden were both in what was considered a clustered major, but that was their choice. So including them in a study and talking to them without taking at the whole big picture may make it appear that academic clustering is not problematic, when in certain situations it absolutely is. On the flip side of that, Jim was not in a clustered major, but very much had his academic agency limited, as he started his business major very late, despite communicating his interest from day one. This actually, 3 years down the road, ended up having, he had to take all of the most difficult courses in the business major all in one semester to graduate, which caused him a great amount of stress and almost cost him his eligibility. Again, in studies using the 25% metrics, gym experience would have been ignored, even though it's clear that the same mechanism for academic clustering were present in his experience. Reframing this definition to help make sure that we're examining the experience of the student themselves is pivotal to ensure that we create systems that allow student athletes to pursue their preferred majors regardless of their participation in their sport. My second recommendation for practice offers a solution to this problem. Due to the fact that most previous studies use deficit-based narratives to explain why academic clustering happens, many of the solutions are about what students need to do. But given that this study is grounded in ecological systems theories, my solution puts the onus back on the ecosystems around the athlete. In this case, the NCAA, the universities, the athletic academic staff, and coaches. So before we get into discussing the NCAA and universities, I think it's important for those of you who do not work in sports to have a small background in student eligibility. So on the left side here, we see that a student needs 120 credits to graduate. 40 of those credits are gen ed, 72 of those credits are in their major, so that means they have what we call free electives. If a student transfers in 90, 24 of those credits fit with the gen eds, 50 of them fit within the major. That means the student has 16 free electives that they're transferring in. But for NCAA eligibility, we can't count all 16 of them. We can only count 8 because the way the major breakdown is on the left only allows 8 to count. So this is what I would call a great situation for a transfer. This almost never happens. Most of the time, it looks like this. Again, credits need to graduate 120, gen ed's 40, major 72. But in most cases, kids are going to maybe bring in 24 gen eds, maybe 30 credits that would actually fit into this major. And even then, that's not likely, which leaves them, again, losing 28 credits. So you could be going into your senior year of college and immediately upon transferring lose 28 credits and be nowhere near where you need to be for eligibility purposes. So the current avenues to fix this are, one, and this is sort of what ends up happening a lot, is to change the major. Two is to appeal courses. That often takes a lot of time. You need to have syllabi, course descriptions. Some schools are not super cooperative in making sure that that you can even get that information. Another solution is to take courses in summer that count towards multiple requirements. So you can take a class that will count for gen ed and for your major. That opens up another free elective space for something that you transferred in to come in and count now. The issue with this is that it's even further constricting academic freedom because now are we not only pigeonholing them into majors, we're pigeonholing them into specific classes because they meet multiple degree requirements. Another solution that happened at the first school that I worked at a lot is you can be a double major and you would only be certified under one major. So we would declare them in a small major that had a ton of free elective rooms while we were slowly working towards the major that they were intended in. So other solutions to fix this. First and foremost, the NCAA must reform eligibility rules to address the effect that NIL and the multiple transfer policies have had on the academic experience. Currently, the NCAA requires students to have completed a specific percentage of their degree in order to remain eligible. However, these thresholds were created when students were spending 4 years at the same institution. For students like Isaac and Jacob, who transferred multiple times during their college careers, these percentage and eligibility rules should be adjusted so that students are not forced to pick majors that they are not interested in when they transfer, especially when you consider the fact that multi-year scholarships means that some students are, the absence of multi-year scholarships mean that some students are being forced to enter the transfer portal due to their scholarship not being renewed. I had several situations where I could get students to graduate on time in their preferred major, but because we couldn't get them eligible, we couldn't meet the 60, 80% or whatever it was, they just ended up not doing the major they want. And that's what I mean when I say we maybe need to relook at the 40, 60, 80 rule. If the NCAA wishes to uphold its mission of fostering education through athletics, it also must collaborate closely with federal and state lawmakers to develop more coherent and consistent policies. Much like the NCAA, universities also need to be aware of the changing landscape of college athletics and adjust their policies and processes to fix these changes, not just for athletes, but for any transfer student. So first and foremost, universities need to work with students, need to work on creating flexible curriculums or course offerings that allow students who transfer to pursue their desired major without losing credits because they don't fit into the specific niche of a specific class. For example, if Jacob's business classes had transferred in, there was a possibility he could have pursued business or communications at SSU, or at the very least, not had to take 32 credits over the course of 2 summers in order to graduate on time. Having smaller majors, more flexibility in curriculum, more acceptance of transfer credits, individualized majors that don't have a million barriers, hoops to jump through, and accepting more transfer credits. Doing any one of these would greatly reduce these problems. And a lot of times, the unwillingness of universities to do any of these things is often driven by concerns about maintaining academic standards. But the ironic part of that is refusing to make these changes can further undermine those standards by creating situations in which students are denied the opportunity to pursue the academic degree of their choice. In terms of processes, it would also be helpful if athletic departments could have transcripts evaluated before the student commits so that recruits can be informed about what their major options will be when they're enrolled. Streamlining transcript evaluations and transfer credit evaluations would be extremely beneficial. Another solution or something that could really, really help is advisors in different departments and majors should be educated about the challenges that transfer student athletes face with respect to eligibility so that they can advise them creatively and find ways to get students as close to their progress towards degree. Universities must also ensure that there are sufficient sections of high demand courses available at varied times so that student athletes do not miss them because of practice conflicts. Lastly, academic support staff must ensure that they are providing culturally responsive advising. Something that I've often witnessed both in my own experience and in the literature is that coordinators or advisors are asking students what they're interested in. If the student said that they don't know or they don't really care, they use it as a justification to encourage students to select a clustered major. This is where culturally responsive advising could be the most beneficial, because there has to be an understanding that the answer of I don't care may not mean what you think it means at face value. Students who are first generation, who have not come from backgrounds where education was highly valued, are not going to know how to answer those questions. The perceived lack of care or lack of academic preparation is not something innate within the student, but instead a byproduct of the environment that they grew up in. As evidence from the experience of Jordan, Jaden, and Mike, the fact that their academic staff were willing to work with them and push them outside of their comfort zone has created an environment where they were able to pursue a major that was both interesting to them and fit their career options. On the other hand, Thomas, Jim, Steve, and Jacob, who all came from backgrounds where a college education was valued, showed how their environment prior to enrollment in college shaped the way they viewed their education. What's even more important to note that of those four, only Thomas and Steve were able to avoid the external influences on their major and course selection, as Jim started his major late and Jacob ended up having to choose a major that did not meet his career goals. And as I'm saying this, Thomas committed yesterday to a new school and again was likely told that he will not be able to pursue his major. So in this case, as time progressed, it's really only Steve who was able to avoid those external influences. Um, Last recommendation for practice is that coaches have to understand that they have an important role to play in ensuring that student athletes can truly balance their athletic and academic responsibilities. The structure of daily athletic life, particularly with the demands of practice, travel, competition, can interfere directly with the student's ability to engage in their desired field of study. When practice times are inflexible or prioritized above all else, student athletes may be forced to drop classes, delay progress in their major, or even change majors entirely. In many cases, athletes end up choosing less demanding majors that fit with their athletic schedules better. Coaches can help reduce this pressure by creating more flexible and student-centered practice schedule. Rather than treating academics as a secondary concern, coaching staff should work with academic advisors and campus support services to ensure that athletes can register for and attend the classes that they need. And then lastly, my recommendations for future research. Given the significant amount of studies that examine clustering from a group perspective, and do not include the experience of the student athlete, there needs to be more studies on the clustering from the student athlete's perspective, looking at different institutions, conferences, divisions, so we compare clustering, not only rates, but how it happens across the board. Additionally, there need to be studies that examine the impact that clustering has on GPA, graduation, and career outcomes, especially for those who transfer, as there's little to no research on the transfer portal, on how the transfer portal impacts academic clustering because it is a relatively new phenomenon in college athletics. And that is the end of my presentation. I am here for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you, Rachel.
Megan, hey, Gabriel,
Hey,
Gabriel
okay.
Fontan here from
Hey,
Norfolk State. So I was like, great job, by the way.
thank you.
What's some of the maybe recommendations you might have for coaches to understand cultural experience when it comes to dealing with with these student athletes and their major selections?
I think like I mentioned, just emphasizing that I think coaches a lot of time view students with like one lens and don't aren't willing to look past, okay, they're all coming from different backgrounds, different families, they grew up in different areas. So you could have a kid who comes and knows what they want to do and they're completely engaged and they're 100%, and a kid who is not. And that doesn't the kid's not a bad kid. So I think just getting them to understand that these are, or trying to get them to understand that these are learned behaviors and not like innate characteristics of them as human beings. Like these things are changed. These things are like, nobody likes to fail. Nobody likes to sit in classes and not know what the teacher's talking about. Like no one enjoys that. One coach I had a conversation with, I elaborated it to like, or compared it to like, you brought them here to play basketball. But imagine if we were like, you have to play volleyball too. And you're looking at them and they're tall and athletic. So they should be able to play volleyball. But if they've never played volleyball before, they're not going to compete well with a college volleyball team because they've never played. They're tall, they're athletic, they look like they have the tools. That doesn't mean that they're going to be good at volleyball at all. So I try to like keep it in the sports frame because that's what they seem to understand. And that's sort of what it is with school too. They get here, you may think they're prepared. They're not at all. Some of them are, some of them won't be. Um, and some of them aren't going to want to tell you that they're not. Some of them are not going to know that they're not prepared. So just sort of keeping an open mind, is what I would recommend. Thank you, everyone. I see a question. I was wondering if you could talk about how the student athletes that didn't pick the cluster degrees utilize internal motivation. Um, what was interesting is that most of them would be very outspoken from the very beginning. I think a lot of times they know that clustering happens. Like they know that it's a real thing that athletes do easy majors and easy classes. So most of mine were very much like from the beginning, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I'm not doing that. Um, and unfortunately, the system, a normal student would come in and they would just choose the major that they want, and that would just be the end of it. Um, but it's hard for them to advocate for themselves. And even having one person in that corner, whether that be me or a tutor or whoever, who's able to advocate, could tell them to continue to advocate for themselves, is really what's most important. Um, it's up to us to, it's up to us to meet the student athletes where they are. Yes, absolutely. I think that's like a real thing and it's easy. It's like, you see someone driving in a car, they cut you off, you're gonna think mean things about that person. The mean thing that you say is going to vary based off of what they look like and our like internal biases. And then you find out later that like their wife was in labor and now their behavior is totally excused. It's the same thing with athletes. I think we have to really try to like we see the behavior, try not to make an assumption. Like let's ask questions, let's talk to them. And another thing that's really important is like we don't get to decide how long it takes them to be comfortable talking to us about it. Like we just have to build those relationships every single day. We don't get to decide what they need for us to open up. We don't get to decide how long that's going to take. And that may be very frustrating because you may be really putting in effort, but like they come with their own trauma and their own struggles, and you just have to wait till you get there. And it's not something that like once you have it, you're good. Like you have to earn it every day. Every day you show up for work, you have to make sure that you're there for them. They know that you're a safe space, because it's so easy for them to just tunnel back in their holes, especially when there are external people who are like, yeah, let's just take this class. Like I have students every registration. They're like, what's a list of easy classes? And their teammates give them them. I'm like, no, what's easy for you is not going to be what's easy for them. What's easy for you is something that you have background knowledge in, something that you care about. Otherwise, you're going to hate it. I think that's it. Does anyone else have any other questions? All right. Thank you guys so much for coming. You all have a wonderful day. I don't know if I need to do anything else, but thank you guys. Hi, Gabe.